Hello and welcome to Curator with a Camera. I'm Anthony Coulls, Senior Curator at the National Railway Museum, and we're here today at New Hall in Locomotion to have a look at the revolutionary Sentinel Diesel Shunter. The diesel shunter had been a feature of Britain's railways since the 1920s. In the post-First World War era, the internal combustion engine found a new market and a new outlet in railways. From narrow gauge locomotives developed for use in the trenches, the technology grew to standard gauge applications, and new companies like Simplex, Motorrail came into being to create shunting locomotives for the industrial market. In the 1930s, individual locomotive manufacturers such as Hunslet and Barclay, very traditional names in the steam locomotive world, began to diversify and build their own diesel shunting locomotives, not necessarily for the mainline railways, but for industry, the private sidings and the factories around the country and the collieries where the money was made and the goods produced that the national network then began to distribute. And a lot of these private builders began to sell their wares to the mainline railway companies. So there are steam shunting engines being built by the mainline railway works until the 1950s. The layout of the initial diesel shunters very much followed the same plan as a steam shunter. Some of the Hodswell-Clark engines from the 1930s indeed had fake chimneys on them so they looked like a steam locomotive, and even a pretend bunker on the back of the cab so that the crews would see something that they thought was familiar, they knew what it did. But the layout of a diesel shunter is very important. These spend their days in goods yards where visibility is a real key thing. Shunting yards and marshalling yards are dangerous places. Hundreds if not thousands of wagons on the move a day, and accidents in goods yards were rife, particularly through people not having a very good line of sight. So the traditional layout of a shunting engine had a cab at one end and either a boiler or a bonnet, depending on whether it was a steam or a diesel engine, at the other end, and quite often that got in the way. So in the 1950s, where does Sentinel come in? Well, Sentinel began life in the early 1900s as a company called Allen and McClellan in Glasgow, and they made steam lorries. Now, in the mid 1910s, they moved production to Shrewsbury in Shropshire, and they became the Sentinel Wagon Works, making steam lorries. And they carried on as that was their main business throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Legislation on steam-powered lorries changed things for them, with pneumatic tyres coming in and other developments, and Sentinels were forced to diversify their production, and they began to make diesel lorries, and they also built steam locomotives to a particular design where they had a high pressure boiler and a high revving, fast revving steam engine, so they're quite slow speed but quite powerful. At the turning point for Sentinel was 1957, when the company was bought out by Rolls-Royce. Rolls-Royce, of course, known for aero engine manufacture and also very high range cars, but Rolls-Royce also made really high-spec diesel engines, diesel power units. Now, Rolls-Royce saw the market, the potential for diesel locomotives. And in fact, the very first diesel shunters made by Rolls-Royce under the Sentinel name included this machine behind us. This is works number 100003 of 1959, so it's the third one that they made. And it was designed to be initially a demonstrator. The first 4 Sentinels were demonstrator locomotives and used all around the country. But where they broke the mould is they used the underframe, the same basic underframe as the steam locomotive, but then you look at the design of this, and Sentinel really broke the mould. They won a design award in 1964, Sentinel did, because of the layout of this and how things had changed. But as we walk around the engine, we'll look and see what made the Rolls-Royce Sentinel such a revolution and a difference to all the other diesel shunters that had gone before it. Let's take a walk around the Sentinel and look at some of the things that make it truly innovative. But while we're here, let's have a quick look at where we are. This is New Hall at Locomotion, opened in May 2024, and of course somewhere featured in our great film about how we got all of these vehicles in here. Back to the Sentinel for now. What is it? Well, it's a diesel shunter, it's a four-wheeled locomotive. That's basically what it is really, but the Sentinel, we talked about Sentinel. Why is it a Sentinel? Well, Sentinel Wagon Works, or Sentinel Company of Shrewsbury, their motto, of course, the little legacy on it, the little emblem, is a Sentinel. And there he is on the front of the radiator, little figure there, Sentinel. Now, Sentinel's slogan was ever watchful and on the alert, as a Sentinel would be. And there's the figure of the Sentinel with his sword there. Had the engine been brand new, the name Sentinel would have been across there as well. And then you've got this much longer sword emblem coming down the front. Really quite groundbreaking. You know, Sentinels were very proactive in their PR. This was something so different. In fact, one of the companies that worked with them, Thomas Hill, made another type of locomotive called the Vanguard, and it just shows how the companies were really keen to promote what they got. So there we are on the front of the radiator, the Sentinel man and a couple of headlights. And what else have we got looking at it? Two very large buffers. On industrial railways and goods yards, there's quite often very sharp curves, and you don't want to have what's called buffer locking, because if the buffers end up locking between a locomotive and a wagon, you can end up with the thing coming off the track, and it ends up being just more time out of the day. You will notice there's nothing else on the front of the engine except the coupling hook there. So some of our locomotives have brake hoses, whether it's air brake or vacuum brake. The Sentinel only has air brake fitted to the locomotive itself, so it's only there for pushing wagons around and stopping them as and when it can. A couple of marker lights on the front as well, so that you can see whether they're white lights for going one way or red lights for the other way, the tail lights. And then part of the things that make it really different, there's this great access way right along the side of the engine compartment. You know, that was not there on other diesel shunters. Readily accessible steps up on the side of the engine. And yeah, that's easy access for the shunter who's riding on the engine, safely out of the way. He's tucked in, he's not hanging off the side. Safety, absolutely perfect. And inside the bonnet, along this end of it, is a 6-cylinder Rolls-Royce engine unit producing about 255 horsepower. So that's a superb piece of engineering in there, slightly hidden away at the moment, but there it is. The power unit is kept in there, and it's got a hydraulic transmission which then drives 4 wheels underneath the loco. Patent Sentinel locomotive. There's the name. And then the drive chains you can see. We talked in the introduction about Sentinel basing the running gear, the chassis, the underframe, on their steam locomotives from the 1950s. And this pretty much is the same drive system, the drive chain from the drive chain down through to the wheel sets, and the springs there and the bearings and the frame. This is the same underframe as the Sentinel steam locomotive. On engines such as this very early locomotive, there is even a cross member on the frame just around where the boiler would have been, a 3-inch girder where the boiler would have been supported. So they didn't actually change that until a little bit later in the production. But there we are, spring there, and again, Sentinel patent locomotive. But what else have we got on the side of it? RMS Locotec. This is the story of where this engine finished up its working life. And there on the side, again, we've walked past it there, H001. RMS Locotec are a hire company where you can hire a locomotive from them. Not quite like a car and go driving it off down the track, but industries latterly throughout the 90s and 2000s found it much easier than to own a locomotive themselves and have to commit to the upkeep and maintenance of it. With privatisation, they say, right, well, we're going to hire an engine for as long as we need it. So RMS Locotec bought this engine and put it as H001 in their hire fleet. And here it is, pretty much as it came out of service. So you've got modern accoutrements on the top of it there, yellow flashing lights, so that in an industrial works you can see where it is moving around. Big headlamp as well up on top of the cab, But of course, like we were saying about the revolutionary design of this, huge windows on the cab side of it and at the front and the back, so that the visibility is really improved, something that you never had on any of the shunters previous to this. Looking down at the side of it, there's one of the sandboxes, able to give you extra grip on the rails where you need it. There is the sand going down, or would be the sand going down onto the track. One of the brake blocks as well there. There's quite a lot of meat on that brake block still, but this engine technically came to us as a runner. It would actually, if we put a battery on it and serviced it, probably start quite straightforwardly. But hey, just looking at it again, so very, very different. And you can see how, when it was entered for the Design Award, it was so revolutionary that along with the Lansing Linde forklift truck, or Lansing Bagnall I think it was, forklift truck, you know, these weren't just industrial machines, they were things to look good, they looked the part. So there is the bonnet at the other end, which has part of the hydraulic transmission and gear in it, and compressors and things like that. It's not a radiator, so you can see there's no grille, but in terms of making it look good, it's just another part of that very different styling. But what I love on this engine is little bits like here on the handrail, where you can see the legacy of its industrial past. So this began life as a shunting locomotive, a demonstrator going round different industrial facilities where Sentinel could try and prove it. It went to collieries, it went to other light railways, it went to goods yards. But in the end, in 1960, so it was built in 1959, in 1960 it was bought by the Bass Brewery in Burton-on-Trent, the famous Bass Brewery. In fact, there is a picture of it, courtesy of 53A Models of Hull, and that's it in the Bass Brewery at work. When Bass began to scale back on their railway operations in 1968, it was sold again, and it had a very checkered career. It worked at Seaham Harbour in the northeast. It then went to the Central Electricity Generating Board at Haverton Hill, the power station there on Teesside, near Stockton-on-Tees and Billingham. And it worked at Mostyn Docks in North Wales, and then latterly at Bulby Potash Mine in Cleveland, and that is the last site that it worked at. So all this gunge all over the steps and whatever, this is all the potash residue and debris from when it was in the works at Bulby. So this is a locomotive as it has come out of industry. It has all the dents and the scratches and the signs of its hard working life. And what I was showing you with the handrail there is the classic turkey red of Bass, of the Bass Brewing Company. They painted all of their locomotives in. So, you know, the years of wear on this handrail actually shows us the different degrees and the different colours the engine's been. There's green there, and there's also a yellow in there as well. Now, it was yellow when it was at one of the wagon works, the standard wagon works. So there's a whole thing about learning the evidence of this machine through the paint that's on it. That's incredible, really. But yeah, there's yellow again on the door handle, on the edge of the door, should I say. So an engine that's had an incredibly long and hard-working life. But in terms of what it represents to us in the collection, it's very similar to bauxite. And you'll see bauxite in another of our Curators with a Camera series, where it's presented by Bob Gwynn. And Bob tells us about how bauxite is presented in as it operated condition. Let's go and have a look in the cab and see what makes it work. Welcome to the cab of the Sentinel. It's a little bit echo in here because there's no padding and nothing to deaden the sound of me, but the first thing you'll notice is it's really light and spacious in here. You know, we could do a lot of Curators with a Camera in traditional locomotive cabs, steam locomotives and big heavy diesels, but you know, there's actually quite a lot of space around me. That, you know, this dashboard here, there's a huge amount there. Okay, the seat, I think that's a bit of an industrial legacy there, that you know, there's no upholstery at all, it's a bit of a plank. But compared to the majority of locomotive cabs that we've used in this series, I've actually got space to swing a cat. But what have we got that makes the Sentinel so different? Well, we've talked about the line of sight and the safety for the driver and for the shunter on the ground. Now, looking out of these huge great front windows, there we go. We've got a line of sight right down to the front end and the buffers. And likewise, if we go around to the back, there we are again. A line of sight straight from the window down to the buffers and the draw gear. So you can see right to the front and the back of the locomotive. And the driver sits on his little plank down here. It's quite comfy, and I can look from front to back. So the driver is sitting here on his plank, on his seat, from sideways, and he goes from the back, round through the control desk to the front. So he doesn't have to get up, he doesn't have to turn round. This is such an easy locomotive to access, and all the controls come to hand quite straightforwardly. Now, this engine's had some work done to it, but Sentinel's design went so much that the different control handles had a different feel to them. So if you're in the dark and you're working in a yard, you don't have to look, you feel which one comes to hand. So what actually do we have here that makes the Sentinel go? There's not many controls at all compared to things. So this is a diesel hydraulic locomotive. So it doesn't have a gearbox like a mechanical shunter. It doesn't have a control handle like a diesel electric, where you're controlling the amount of electricity going through the motor. But what it does have is a hydraulic impeller, and it's creating oil pressure in that to then drive the hydraulic motors, which then drive through those chains to the axle. So control-wise, we have very simply forward there, and reverse, and D-clutch, which is like there you are for neutral. We have the sanders, sanding. So this is air. So it isn't gravity that's putting the sand down on the track, it's air pressure. So that it says forward for sanding the forward of it, back for sanding the back, and then that just says sanding so that we know what it is. Air brake, so this control here, air brake off, air brake into lap position so it's ready for application, and air brake on, which therefore means you're putting the brake on. And then this is very simply your throttle. So this is speed, as it were, but it's locked in. I can't move that because currently the engine is declutched. And then the last one there is the one that everybody wants to know about, is the horn. So it's sprung, bap, bap, off we go. So a really simple locomotive. Few dials to have a look at on the, I can't really say the dashboard, but it feels like a dashboard. But again, look at the space around me. This is an absolutely amazing engine. And the driver isn't necessarily looking at these particularly whilst he's on the side, but we've got the revs, the rev counter for the engine, brake pressure for the brake cylinder. Bear in mind this is straight air on the engine only, so not an air brake on the train. Amps, how much charge you've got, oil pressure for the engine itself, control fluid, there we are, and then yeah, engine oil pressure, amps. Temperature for the coolant, how hot the thing's got, how many hours the engine has run, and then its MPH, its speedometer, miles per hour. And the top speed of the Sentinel, you can see it's not really going to tear it up. The top design speed of this is actually 17 miles an hour. And it was designed to be able to pull about 1,300 tonnes on the level. So that's what you have. There's a few switches around for lights and other bits and pieces. And there we go. Leave engine keys for, oh, that's obviously a message for somebody at one of the hire companies. You know, you scroll all over it as you will. Windscreen wipers, a light in the roof, top of the roof, and there's our master switch for the cab light now. I think this is one of the alterations made as part of the hire fleet. So the cab light there, oh, actually that's the light on the front of the cab that we saw, and then a beacon so that that orange beacon is turned on and off as it travels through the industrial sites so that folks working on the ground can see what it's doing. And then of course our very last control, which we should never forget, very large handbrake stanchion there in the middle of the cab for the parking brake. So the handbrake is only ever used to park the locomotive. These doors slide across the way, backwards and forwards. So rather than being on a hinge, they're dead easy to move in and out. And really, that's as much as it is. That is how simple and effective the cab of the Sentinel Shunter is. Those massive windows, it's very light, it's very airy. Simple, as I say, to sit down and drive it. Everything comes to hand, forward, reverse, sand, brake, throttle. You can sit there and see yourself just driving along, like, there you go, just keep a hand on that, throttle off, and you're controlling the brake at the fingers there. Can you imagine in 1959, when this was a prototype, going round the collieries and the industries of the UK, what a world of difference this made to people who were used to using steam locomotives that could be 40, 50, 60, even 70 years old at the time. And you go from a rattly old steam engine to something like this, where if you really wanted to, you could wear white overalls. All you do at the end of the day, get out of it, put the handbrake on, turn the engine off. Simple. Go home, clean, no more dirty hands. Fabulous. So what's the place of the Sentinel Shunter in the history of railways in the UK? Well, it's very clear that it looks completely different to what the railways had seen before. That cab situated part way along, that's something that's really quite different. You know, a diesel locomotive doing that. But also the layout of the cab with the controls duplicated on either side, the control handles differently shaped so that the driver can feel what he's doing, not necessarily just by having to look at it. So the layout of the cab doesn't just help the driver, it helps the shunter on the ground and improves safety because of that visible sight line down the side of the locomotive from the front and the back. But also the fact that out of the 292 Sentinel Diesel Shunters produced from 1959, a good number of those are still in operation in the 2020s, is true testimony to the soundness and the strength and the quality of this design, and places the Sentinel where it fits in the story of Britain's railways. Thanks for joining us today for Curator with a Camera, where we've looked at the revolutionary Sentinel Diesel Shunter. If you've liked our film, why not like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on future films from the team.